All right, so to give you a plan on things, what I plan on doing today, right now, is going through the first section of this book. A lot of it will be review, and that's, in my opinion, is fun. Then we will go through the next section tomorrow. When I say the next section, I'm basically spending no time on the jQuery. jQuery isn't dead, but it's dying. Okay, which is weird because it's still on millions of websites. And if we get all that done, then starting on Friday, um, I will go through a little bit of the stuff at the end. I don't want to go through the node stuff yet, but a little bit of the stuff. And I said Friday is basically going to be a day that I want you to finish this up. I don't want it where you're going to be working on a lot of homework outside of class here. Next week, we're going to write a bunch of applications. We'll start with vanilla JavaScript, and we'll move on from there. We're going to do them as a class. All right? And then what I'm going to ask is we'll get them to a certain point, and I'll say, now you finish it up. All right? And if we get all that stuff done by next week, I'm not saying we will, but hopefully we do. And if we get all that stuff done, then either, I would probably guess Tuesday. Remember that Monday the 6th, we don't have class because it's Labor Day. So probably Tuesday the 6th, we'll have our first test. And it'll be basically the wrap up. You'll have to create some web stuff, but it's not going to be anything on HTML or CSS. It's all basically going to be on JavaScript. All right, then we're going to move into the node part of the class. All right. So with that said, this is the first 7 chapters. Now, we're going to bop through a lot of these. In fact, chapter 1 I'm not even going to go through because that's just the one that shows you what a client is and what a server is, etc. I think you all know that. Chapters 2, 3, and 4 we'll go through fairly quickly because it's on how to go and debug or to create and debug JavaScript code. Chapter 6 I want to spend some time on because they talk about DOM scripting, and you have to at least understand that. You'll have to for when we get into the React portion of the class. All right, so I'm going to jump back here just for a second, and I'll go back to page 1. So again, if I said that right, I think I did, then, all right, we will go through these first 7 chapters today. If I say anything tomorrow about jQuery, it'll be minimal at best, and there's a very good chance we'll say nothing. Then tomorrow we'll go over 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16. Now, believe it or not, it's going to take pretty much, forgetting about chapter 19 that you see on the screen right now, it's going to take pretty much a week to go over chapter 17 and 18, because that's the hardest stuff. And what I'd like us to be able to do is to do at least a couple of applications where we work with Ajax, and that we go out and we'll use vanilla JavaScript at the beginning. And what we will do is we will go out to the internet, call APIs to give us information, bring that information back into our programs, and be able to massage and use that information in our program. That's a lot of what this class is going to be about. After you learn how to do that with vanilla JavaScript, we're going to start, there'll actually be some duplication, because once we get into the Node.js portion of the class, we might even go back and do some of the same apps, but do them as Node apps. All right? So, like I said, that's what you've got. I don't know if you'd say to look forward to, but that's pretty much what we're going to be talking about in here. All right. And like I said, Chapter 1, this Introduction to Web Development, I don't think it pays to talk about any of this. Okay? I guess the how to run a JavaScript app, but you know that. Again, it's been a while since you've done that. Notice they've changed in here to Visual Studio Code, because I'm using the version 4 of their CSS and HTML book, the same ones you guys had. They have brackets in there. All right. So it's funny. I didn't go over any of that in class, but what I did was I said, now this is how you do it in Visual Studio Code, and we kept bobbing back and forth between the two of them. So kind of interesting. All right. And where I think there's something in here that will be of use to us in some form or other, all right, I'm going to go over it, even if it means, like I said, a little bit of duplication. So I'm going to type in this to start with. For example here, where should I show me my okay, this is good. I'm going to talk about what's in the chapter, but this is in there, but this is over and above what's in your book. All right. Now, this talks about a fairly new attribute in JavaScript that's called defer. All right. You may or may not be aware of the fact on how things load in when you're working with your browser. Typically, what happens is it tries to load all of your HTML first, then your CSS, and then your JavaScript. Except it doesn't always do it that way. And the problem is you don't ever want it set up so that your JavaScript gets loaded and it tries doing something before the HTML that it's going to act upon has been totally loaded. All right. So we're used to doing things like this. And I have talked with you last semester about should that go at the bottom of the head section? Should that go at the bottom of the body section right before the ending body tag? Historically, people have placed that in the body tag, right at the very bottom. Okay? That's just been the way people have done it. Now, what's recommended today, so they're showing it right here. Okay? So let's take a look at this. Defer is an attribute in JavaScript which stores true-false value as a Boolean. It is in JavaScript used for loading JavaScript utilities after loading the main HTML content. So it's trying to assure that all of your HTML has been loaded. Well, one thing about this is, yeah, you can still put it there, but guess what? If you use the word defer, you can actually put that in your head tag. It doesn't matter anymore where you put it because defer says defer or hold back on loading this JavaScript until the HTML has all been loaded. All right? It's nothing magical that happens. You don't see anything, etc., that it happens, but that's the recommended way for you to do things. That's all I'm saying. Okay. So in here, you notice it says how to use the script element and when to use the no script element. They don't mention that in here because that really wasn't very available. I would think if I checked defer in here, it may not even be in this book. I don't know. I don't want to do it right now. You don't have to do it either, but I just wanted to mention that to you. Okay. All right. By now, everybody in here should be cool with the script tag. How to use it, where to use it, putting in a JS folder, etc. We are going to end up, as we work in here, making some changes. What do I mean? Well, when you start working with Node, okay, when you start working with Node and we're going to come in and we're going to start using stuff with Node, you're going to end up creating what's called a public folder. All right? And in that public folder, you're going to put another folder in there. It's going to be called CSS. In that public folder, you're going to put another folder in there called JS. But that's CSS, and that JS is client-side CSS and client-side JavaScript. All right? We will end up having files outside of the public folder that'll be called server.js, or you can call it index.js. It doesn't matter. And if I may have just misspoke, so I'm going to say it again. That stuff in the public folder, that is all client-side stuff you've been doing previously. It's client-side CSS, it's client-side JavaScript, it's client-side HTML. The stuff that you'll be doing outside of the public is server stuff. And when we get to React, good, bad, or indifferent, it gets even a little bit more confusing because you're going to have both an index.html typically for the client side and an index.html for the server side. You might even have an index.js for the client side and an index.js for the server side. They're 4 different files. All right. And it's what kind of code are they running? Are they running client-oriented code or are they running server-oriented code? If, for whatever reason, that confuses you, please don't let it. All right. I mean, I had one of the students in the morning class come and talk to me today, and I can just tell, you know, he's confused about a few things. But he asked good questions, and I can tell he's been listening. I don't know if you still have any interest in possibly tutoring this semester or not. Your call. But if you do, let me know. No one's asked yet, but I don't know if they will or not. So. Okay, well, I forgot about you. Yeah, I can, you know, and that's fine. All right, so again, that's how we bring it in. Now remember, it is totally possible to embed JavaScript inside of an HTML file. You shouldn't do that just in the same way you shouldn't embed CSS directly. Remember, there's 3 ways to embed CSS, but we talked about that inline, like using span tags and stuff. Don't do that. Don't do this. And I'm taking for granted that if I say something, unless people have a question, not only do you get it, but you're not going to do it. All right? The no-script element isn't that big a thing. Remember, the no-script element is used if for some reason the user has turned off JavaScript. I would guess that well over 90% of people who use a computer don't have a flaming clue as far as what JavaScript is, how it's used, why it's used, etc. And out of the ones that do understand it, all right, I'd say most of them don't want to turn it off anyway. Now, typically, one time that you might turn off JavaScript is you want to make sure when you're working with forms, if the JavaScript is off, that the stuff is still handled correctly. All right, but I don't think we're going to have really much to worry about with no script. And again, all no script is it handles when you don't have JavaScript turned on. All right? And notice it says please enable it. It doesn't say please download it because it's on every machine. So if someone doesn't want it, I suppose if you took the time, you could go through, figure out where everything was and remove it. I don't know if that'd even be worth your time, but it's much easier. You can usually, like, you can go into I don't know, dots here, but you can go into Chrome and disable the JavaScript. It's just literally clicking a few buttons. All right. Now, one thing I do want to mention to you. We don't have a book. You know that. I've got some books that you can use. I've shown you some of them already. I showed you that Flavio Cope stuff. And one thing I forgot to mention to you, because I didn't say it again yesterday, there are a bunch of, there's another site that's out there. It's called like goalkickers.com or something like that. And they've got a lot of free books. We may look at one or more of those as we go on. But most JavaScript books that you see today, most, don't use, they very rarely, if ever, use semicolons. All right? And what they'll typically say is, well, if you don't use a semicolon, you get an implied semicolon. And with an implied semicolon, the system puts it in for you. And that's totally fine. I'm going to continue using them because I like to look at it this way. Not to criticize anyone who doesn't, but I'm more a purist. And I know that in virtually every other language, it requires semicolons at the end of lines, and they want them to be there. And I just think that for that reason, I'm going to put them there. All right? The other thing we're going to talk about in here is, notice in here, you don't see any vars. Var is dead, basically. Don't use the word var anymore with JavaScript. Use either let or use const. And the weird thing about const is, even though they won't say it in this book, let's suppose I create an array. So I create an array called numbers, okay? And I put in there 1, 2, 3, 4, and I make it a const. If I were to ask you, I'm not, but if I were to ask you, if I were to say, can you change those numbers? My answer would be no, it's a const. You can't change the array but you can change what's inside of the array, even if it's a const. Does that make sense? So now if I say const legal age equal 18, I can't go and change it to 21 in the program. I can't do that. But there's a lot, you get a lot of leeway with const. And you may or may not know this, but geez, it was 2 or 3 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, that if I used the word const and I was using an editor like Notepad++, it would show. You would get dark blue, showing it was a keyword. But guess what? Const didn't work. It wasn't supported, basically, by any browser. So I could say const legal age equal 12. Then on the next line, I could say legal age equal 21, and it would take it just fine. That doesn't work like that anymore. All right? But I'm looking at this right here. And why is the stuff that's in here important? Okay? Well, you should be able to look at this. And this, if I were to ask you right here what that is, in fact, let me. Can somebody tell me what's in blue there? Or I guess it's not real blue on the screen there. But what do you think that represents? Can somebody tell me?
What is underneath?
What?
What somebody would enter in or email.
Yeah, but I'm asking you to be real literal. Remember, typically we would come up on top here and we would set that up. You remember the word I used was we'd make an alias. That's an alias for document.getElementById. So what we're doing is we're telling it that something on our HTML has an ID, the pound sign, of email address 1. We want to grab its value, and we want to put it into this variable. I mean, stuff like that, if that doesn't make sense to you, then you better go back. That's one of the reasons I got it. You better go back and review this. All right, because that's a lot of the kinds of stuff that we're going to do.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Why is var dead?
Why is var dead? Because var allows you to cheat. If you put var in certain places in a JavaScript program, it automatically makes the variable global. Even if you put it inside of a function, it's breaking a lot of rules that you shouldn't be allowed to have. All right? That's the best answer that I can give you. Now, look at the if statement. We're never going to write an if statement like that. Get used to using 3 equal signs for virtually everything you do. Remember the difference between 2 equals and the triple equal sign. 2 equals is equality. But with 2 equals, if I have the number 57 and I have the string 57 in double quotes, so I let A equal 57, semicolon. I say let B equal double quote 57, double quote, semicolon. Then if I say if A equal B, it says they're equal. It checks the value itself. It doesn't check the type of variable it is. The triple equal sign is the identity and equality operator. So the triple equal sign checks to be sure that it is of the same type. So if you use the triple equal sign in the example I just gave you, it would fail. All right, so the recommendation is, and I'm kind of surprised they didn't put that in here. And of course, not only is there a triple equal sign, there is an exclamation point equal sign. All right. So I'm just assuming that you're going to use those from now on. All right. Other things, and you know this, JavaScript is case sensitive. All right. Remember that. If you try to do an alert, guess what? Alerts, we're almost never going to use those. We're going to be using the console at almost all times. It's going to be, the only time we're going to be using an alert is if it's some garbage thing that we're going to get rid of right away. All right. Again, notice the syntax rules, they say that it ends with a semicolon. All right. Yeah. But if you don't put it in, 99 times plus out of 100, JavaScript acts as though you did. In fact, in some books I've even read this. Then JavaScript puts in an implied semicolon for you. I don't know how it would do that, but supposedly that's what happens. All right. JavaScript ignores extra white space within statements, and that's true. Now, in most of the stuff that we're going to be doing once we get into Node, strict mode is implied. Remember we talked a little bit about using strict, and what using strict does is it makes JavaScript not so liberal a language. It makes it more conservative. So if you don't do things you probably should do, it'll catch them. Well, in Node, using strict mode is implied, so you don't have to put it in. You still can, I think, but I haven't tried to. As soon as they said it was implied, it's fine. I won't put it in then. All right. You should know now what identifiers are. You should also know how to create identifiers. Come up with a way, with something that is comfortable to you. I use camel casing that they show right there for my stuff. Some people use that snake casing where they don't have anything in uppercase, but they put the underscore in there. All right. In most other languages, in fact, there are other languages that don't allow the underscore. Virtually every language that I know allows you to camel case. That's why I do it that way, because it makes it easier when I go from language to language. That's all. All right. Again, your identifiers that you create are case sensitive. Now, it doesn't say it here. Notice it says they can only contain letters, numbers, the underscore, and the $sign. I think you all see that. All right. Now, it says they can't start with a number. What does that mean? Well, there's four other things, or four things total. They can start with a letter. They can start with an underscore. They can start with a $sign. I would recommend you never use a $sign in your variables or identifiers. Why do they allow you to do that? Because a lot of people do a lot of work with JavaScript and PHP. In PHP, every variable has to start with a $sign. All right? Not here. But if you're going to be doing a lot of work between them, what a lot of people do is they use $signs for their JavaScript/PHP work. All right? I wouldn't recommend the underscore, starting it with an underscore, because there are some system variables that start with an underscore. And why confuse anybody who's working with your program? All right? I just say that you're best off, when possible, just use letters. All right? And this, you should know this by now, this is not only how you would do a variable, like tax rate or whatever, but it's also, typically that's the way that I do methods. Okay? In other words, methods should start with a lowercase as well. When you're working with classes, and that's one thing we have to get into in here, is how you use classes. And JavaScript is odd, the way they use classes. They've got a way they used to do it, and they got a way they do it now. And I will tell you, probably with most of you go, I like the way they do it now much better. Not only that, by going over that with you now won't help the young lady here, but it's very similar to the way we did it when we were working in Java last semester. So it'll make it that much easier when we transition over to Java in the spring semester. All right. Most of the stuff that's in here, I would say just look at that, be consistent. I've said this before. I've been harping on this with the newbies. I got 3 new people, and then I've got James and Nick are back, okay? And I've just told them, even a bad style is better than no style at all, all right? I'm hoping you're not going to have a bad style. And again, I said this to you, I think, yesterday. I'm saying it again right now. I'll continue to bang these kinds of drums. That when you're out looking for a job, all right? In fact, you knew Luke, right? Mm-hmm. He emailed me yesterday. He's going to be a Java. He's going to be writing Java and testing Java and doing a bunch of new Java stuff at a company in CrevCorp. And he said, all I'll tell you is they're paying me quite a bit to start, and they've already told me that I should move up fairly quickly. Now, my guess, he's already got his own website. That wouldn't be a bad thing for you guys to look at doing. And I don't mean, I mean literally buying GabrielReading.com if it exists, that kind of thing. All right, he's got LukeGosnell.com. You can go out there and take a look at it. All right, and what I'm getting to is you want to be consistent. You want to make sure in these programs that you're doing, they'll start pretty easy and they'll get fairly complex. That places that appear to need comments, you put in comments. That you come up with a coding style that at least is a consistent style. It may not be a style that a company you go and apply for that they have, but at least they can see you've got consistency. Because again, sooner or later, there's a good chance that either A, somebody's going to ask you for some of your code, be it GitHub or whatever, or B, you're going to have to take a coding test. There are a lot of places right now that require you to take a coding test. And typically what they'll do is they'll give you like 1 or 2 hours. I know somebody else who they had told me, this is not a student from here, but it's an acquaintance I had from a job I used to have, and he told me he applied at a company. They gave him 2 days. They said, we want you to do this. Right? The bad thing about doing that, they've got checkers and stuff in there now. I mean, if he'd have found it on the internet and put it in there, I'm sure they would have known. But they're looking to see how he does things, and that's all I'm saying to you is that's what companies are going to be looking for. If they haven't interviewed you, but they've looked at your portfolio, oh, that's Aaron, look at that, nice portfolio, seems to know what he's doing. Then they're going to start looking at your code. They're going to do all that kind of stuff typically before they bring you in. Many companies today, especially your bigger companies, they're not going to bring you in unless there's an interest in hiring you. They're not going to bring you in to bring you in. It used to be that way. I went to interviews where one time I went in and I went in 4 times. I would think they were really interested. And they offered a job to somebody else. And it was reverse sexism. I asked why, and they said, because we had to hire a woman. But we were told that we had to interview men too. Now, that's as bad as doing it the other way. All right? And that was a wrong thing to do. I was only just mad because I had to drive an hour to the interview each time, and they had no desire to hire me. And that's okay, but then don't lie to me or lead me on, which is what they did. All right? And actually at the time it was when I was in journalism, and it was working for a TV show, and the TV show bombed, so I was actually happy that it did. All right, there's your reserved words. Okay, those won't change. How's that? Comments, I just mentioned those as far as being liberal with comments, etc. All right, you know the 2 styles of comments, nothing that we have to say in there. And I'm not going to lie to you. Let's just say that you do your last project in here. You are going to do basically a semester type of project. And let's say Gabriel does something. It just blows me away. It's just really fantastic. But he has basically no comments in there. He's probably still going to get an A in it. All right? But I have to give some kind of a baseline for things like documentation. Why? Because you know this. You've heard me say this before. In the olden days, like not when I was your age, but maybe a few years older than you, then either you would get a user manual that would be hard copy, but now it's online, all right? But if you are creating the software, the only types of comments are going to be the ones you put in there, all right? So if you don't comment anything, that's going to stick out too. And I don't mean that you over comment. If there's something that makes sense, if you were writing a program and you had a for loop that was going from 1 to 10, I wouldn't put a comment in there that said, now we're going to have a for loop that runs 10 times. I think that should be obvious. All right, JavaScript primitive data types. Here they are. The new one that's in there is symbol. All right, and when I say symbol, it doesn't mean like an emoji. All right, we'll look at that in a little bit. But numbers, remember one thing about JavaScript, even though it has a parse float and a parse int, to JavaScript, a number is a number is a number. And it does not matter whether it has a decimal place or it doesn't have a decimal place. In other words, there are not different numeric categories for floats or doubles, whatever you want to call them, and ints. Okay, strings, remember, can be in double or single quotes. Again, there is an example. I would recommend, unless you've got strings within strings, just either choosing single quotes all the time or choosing double quotes all the time. You've heard me say this before, you probably have. I use double quotes whenever I can because in most other programming languages, double quotes are used for strings. For instance, next semester, a single quote, that's a char in Java. All right? If you need a string, it has to be in double quotes. All right. Boolean, we all know about symbol, as it says. It's an animal into and of itself. All right. Null, I don't like their definition there. To me, null doesn't mean no value. It means unknown value. All right. You should know this already, but undefined is a value that hasn't been assigned. Remember, the way that this language works, if I come in and say, let's say int h, what's the value of h? That's undefined. And if I try to do something with it, if I try to print it out, or I try to use it in the calculation before I've assigned it a value, I'm going to get an exception. All right? All right. And then there's a big int, as it says, for an extremely large or small number. And you can go in and you can work with this stuff too. You know, as it says, you can work with really big numbers. That's not going to be that big of a thing in here. It's not going to be a thing in here. All right. JavaScript in many ways is unique. I don't know if you've ever tried doing this, but because you've all gone through the C# class, if I go into C# and I create 3 variables, and I let x equal 3, I let y equal 0, and I let z equals x divided by y, I get an error because I'm trying to divide by 0. I get an exception that actually runs. The program stops. In JavaScript, if I do that same thing, it gives me an answer of infinity, which technically when you divide by 0, that's what it's supposed to be. All right, again, we talked about const. Let's take a look and see if they've got any examples in here. Okay. And Gabriel, if you wanted to know more about var, let, etc., you can even look up hoisting in JavaScript. Because hoisting basically means that you can use something or can't use it before you've declared it. And that's another one of the reasons that they went in and they made this change. Let is considered to be much cleaner than var was. Var could potentially lead to errors, where let leads to less errors. That's basically what I've always been told. All right, if you want to do this, I've kind of changed over the years. If you really want to do that and define 2 things together like that, then hell, go ahead and do it. All right, I don't typically do that. I say let x equal 0. Then on the next line, I say let y equal 0. All right? We are not always going to take every variable that we create and initialize it. Just be cognizant of the fact that if you don't, like I mentioned before, it can lead to problems. All right? Don't try to use it before you've given it a value. All right. So this is the kind of thing I told you before. Okay? So this would be one of those things. In fact, there's hoisting. All right. So let's take a look at this. I don't want to read to you, so I'll tell you what. Let me give you a couple minutes, and please either on your machine or up on here, and I'll move it down a bit in a second. I'm on, I don't know what page this is. Tell me, page 70. There's a thing in here that says how JavaScript handles variables and constants. Please give the rest of this page a read. So when they talk about hoisting again, as it's said in here, when you use var, this is one of the things that JavaScript does. And it's not the only language that does that. It allows you to use variables technically before they have been declared. And the reason it does that is, like it says here, at the beginning it scans all of your code and it basically says, oh, that's a variable, that's a variable, that's a constant, that's a variable, etc. The hoisting, all it means is it makes it known to the program that they exist. But when you use var, if you've initialized the variable, it's no longer initialized. All right? Which again, like I said, can lead to problems. With let, that's not the case. All right. And that's pretty much, says to avoid these kinds of problems, you should always declare and initialize a variable or constant before you use it. In addition, you should use let to declare variables. That way, if you accidentally try to use a variable before you declare it, JavaScript will let you know by throwing an error. All right. And I'm not going to go through, this is more of the same on the next page, so you can take a look at it in there. All right. And more. Again, that's not what I plan on doing, is sitting and reading a lot to you in here. But these are just fundamental things. These are the kind of things, to be honest with you, when you brought that up, it made me think, if you went in for an interview as a programmer and you were going to be programming in JavaScript, that's a question you might be asked. Gabriel, tell me the difference between let and var, and why should you use one as opposed to the other? Right, that is there are things you can actually download online, like JavaScript interview questions. That's the kind of question that you're going to find in there. What is hoisting? That's the kind of question you're going to find in there. I was reading this thing the other day from this guy, and he's a programmer today, but he's self-taught, and he said he went in for a job as a JavaScript developer, and they asked him how much JSON he knew, the JavaScript object notation, and he said, who's Jason? And he said basically he kind of lost the job right there. And he'd made a joke out of it, which I guess it was kind of funny, but again, there are just going to be a lot of things that when you go in for an interview, they're going to assume you know. Okay. I don't think there's anything in here that's new. You all know what plus plus and minus minus are. You also all know that you can override that with parentheses. Nothing new in there. You also know there's a plus equals, and the plus equals can be used both on numbers and on strings. There's a minus equals, there's a times equals, and for whatever reason they don't show it, there's also a divide equals and a modulo equals. Again, I just assume that you can look at these and know how they're used. All right. Concatenating strings, you know how to do that. Now, you may or may not know this. I'm going to show you something right now. I'm going to break away from this just for a second. And I want to show you something. So if I come through here and I type in this, let first name equals Jeff, let last name equals Scott, let age equal 64. All right. Now, if I wanted to print on the screen, let's say I just wanted to do an alert. We typically wouldn't, but let's say I wanted to do an alert on this. Typically, in the quote olden days, which means up to a few years ago, you'd do this. Alert, something like this. First name plus first name, oops, plus last name plus last name, and I'm going to put this, there's nothing wrong with putting that on a new line there, age plus age. In fact, I would, thing I didn't do here, put a blank space there. So that should print out if I did it right, and I think I did. If you see a mistake, please let me know. But should print out first name, Jeff, last name, Scott, age, 64. That makes sense to everybody? Now, there's nothing wrong with doing it that way. It still works. But something has been created now that's called template literals, which we may or may not have talked about before. I don't know. I don't think we did. But it's the backtick key. If you look on your keyboard and you look at your escape key in the upper left-hand corner, it's right underneath it. See that? So the way that you would write that today would be like this. You would say alert. All right, and I would go like this. I wouldn't use those. I'd use backticks. So I'd say first name, and then there's no plus sign, but you have to use a $ sign like this. first name, space, last name, $, and in curly braces. Let's make this much easier on myself. I'm just going to call it F name and L name, okay? If it's not okay, I'm doing it anyway. All right. All right. So now I can say, because I want it all to fit on one line. So F name, L name, age, end it with a backtick. See the difference? It's considered to be so much cleaner of a syntax. And you probably, the time is going to come very shortly, where the only time they're going to show this example right here on 5 and 6 is going to be for historical purposes. All right. In fact, when I go in, and I think I told you this already, but we are changing, believe it or not, where are we on Wednesday? We've already done the first 5 chapters of the HTML book. We're going to be through chapter 8 by the end of this week. Okay? They're going to have a test next week, but it's only going to be on the first 3 chapters. And then when they come back from break, they'll have one on the next 3 chapters. Point is, we're only spending 20 days on HTML and CSS, where you guys got 40. Because we had a meeting, telephone meeting, last spring, and Paul, who's very outspoken about stuff, and I think he's right about 99% of the time, but he said, we're not giving them enough time to work on JavaScript. Well, when you got an 80-day class, then you got to cut from the other part of the class, so that's the decision that was made. Whether it's right or wrong, I guess we'll see over time. Now, are there any questions on that? Does that make sense to you? Now, I don't think I put in anything wrong in there as far as syntax. I don't believe so. In parens, in backticks, start the variable with a $, you put the variable name inside the curly braces. Okay? And again, these are called, I've seen different names, but usually they're called template strings, or I call them, and I've seen it like this in many books, template literals. Not sure why they have that name. There's probably a story behind it. Don't know what it is, but there probably is a story behind it. Right. I don't know if you're copying it. Do you have it? Okay. All right. And again, they don't have it here. Oh, it says you can also use a template literal. Okay. Enclosed in backtick. So you actually have it in your book. That's good. Shows you what a great job I did of reading the book before the semester. All right. Escape sequences, there should be nothing new in there. Nothing that surprises you. Again, the one that's I think is funny because it's not in there is \T for a tag. To me, \N and \T are the ones I use 99% of the time. Okay, it used to be with the way Windows did things that you always, when you put in a path to a file, it used backslashes. So you had to always do this to make sure the person knew that was a regular backslash. All right, but that's not typically a case anymore. You can print Unicode characters. So, if you really want to get into that kind of stuff, that's fine. Now, why would that maybe be important? Well, I mean, as an example, not with this one, but, eventually, my hope is at least, that we're all going to be creating some kind of an e-commerce site in here. And you might want to set it up so when the order goes through, you give them a little smiley face. All right, so that's how you could do it. If you say, I don't want to do that, then don't do it. All right, that's pretty good. There's a list of Unicode characters. It's funny, I was under the presumption there were about 60,000 Unicode characters. The last time I read it was closer to 110,000. All right, they've even got Unicode characters, from what I've heard, I've never looked this up, but for like Star Trek language and stuff like that. So, all right, this is an introduction, an intro into object-oriented JavaScript. It's not very big, it's not very long, all right? But you all know what an object is. We did work with objects in C#. You might have found those simple to work with, you might have found those difficult to work with, all right? JavaScript is what I call, it's an object-based language. It's not an object-oriented language. With an object-based language, what it means is you've got object-oriented capabilities, but you never have to use them. When we do Java next semester, it's a totally object-oriented language. Everything you do is done inside of a class. You don't have any choice. That's just the way. If you want to print hello world on the screen, you got to create a class. All right, and then you've got to create a method inside of that class called main and tell it to print it, and that's it. All right. So a property is a data item that relates to an object. A method is just a function inside of a class. All right. All right, so they give some examples. I don't like what's in here because they talk, you may or may not be aware of this, but when you call alert, it's a shortcut for window.alert. Because the window, all right, the alert property is part of the window object. Since the window object is the default object in JavaScript, you don't need to say window dot. You can, it doesn't hurt anything, but it's superfluous. In other words, it's unnecessary. All right? Yeah, don't worry about that stuff. There is some kind of cool stuff, not with location, but that you can actually do. I wasn't even aware of it. I guess I just had never looked for it. But there are things like, there are methods like locale string and other things like that. So if, let's say you're printing out the number 1,212,308. Well, by default, it won't print with any commas. But you can use things like locale string, tell them that it's English, and it'll automatically put the commas in there for you. In some other languages, rather than commas, they use periods. So I think it's like German, for example, if you told them that you were doing that, it would put in dots right there for you. Parse float and parse int, hopefully those are pretty, you know what those are. All right. The write method, I hardly ever use that, and I probably hardly have ever used that with you. What the write method can be used for is literally to write right to the web page itself. All right. There are other ways of doing that. In fact, I don't think I have it up here right now, but when we get into React, you're probably going to be amazed at the HTML file that runs. There's one executable line of code in it. That's it. There's a div, and that div is called a root. You can change the name of it. Most people don't. But you, in your React code, you put everything you want to be thrown inside of there, and that's how you create it. They talk a little about the document object model. There's not enough that it pays to go over it. Miles per gallon, well, look, if you had any problem with the math, I guess you could take a look at that one. And they actually have several versions of the miles per gallon program in this book. All right, before we go on, talk about the essential JavaScript statements. It's 12:58. Let's come back at 1:10, please.